Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
All right. Hey, Matthew. How's it going?
Hey, Carl. Doing all right.
Super. We are into episode 4. Is it 4?
I think that's right.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
4 of Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. And so last time, what we did is we concluded our kind of initial examination of the historicity. There's that big fancy word I've used many times, which is a word I like. I think I just like because it sounds cool.
Oh, yeah.
I've been trying to get really good at a word, semi-quincentennial.
Oh, my.
Yeah,
Have that one in the holster at the
I've
ready.
been working on it because next year, or whenever you're listening, the year 2026 is the 250th birthday of the USA.
And I happen to know there's another fancy $5 word we're going to get to later today. So just as a teaser, you're at least going to walk away with one of those.
Yeah, Scrabble. Historicity, then what does that mean? It's like, how can I know that the thing I'm being told about was actually a thing and not a made-up thing, which made-up things are kind of cool too, but we want to make sure that I understand that, that made-up thing is a made-up thing as opposed to a true thing. And so we were, in essence, addressing questions. In fact, when people think about understanding this evidence for the scripture or evidence for Christianity, I like to think of it as a series of questions that are stated to me. So here's the one we addressed last time basically is, well, how can we trust an ancient source when what you read is actually a copy of the original, which we don't have, and it's written hundreds of years after the event? So we're kind of looking at that, and we talked about how historians do that, how they assess the evidence, kind of work their way through it. And then we turned our focus last episode really deeply towards the evidence around this thing called Christianity in this book called the Bible that has a collection of 66 different writings. And so we examined it. And so when we finished, we concluded that we have more evidence for the person of Jesus than any other founder of a religion, and quite honestly, any other founder of antiquity. And when you compare the evidence, comparing it to other historical works, the way I say it is that the Bible then becomes the most historically secure work of antiquity. And I like the word secure because then as historians, we're not saying I necessarily agree with things in there,
right? But
we are saying what's written there was indeed written there. It wasn't made up later after the fact by somebody else. And there's a scholar in the field who I really like who's passed away now. His name is Dr. Bruce Metzger. And he described that the wealth of manuscript evidence, particularly for the New Testament, compared to other works of antiquity, it's embarrassing by comparison. And we talked about that kind of the Bible, particularly the Old and New Testament, as well as the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. It blows the curb for others, thinking about a grading curve in case that didn't make sense. Now, I do want to make sure we understand, when I say the word antiquity, like what jumps to your mind?
Antiquity, I'm thinking broken vases and columns and stuff from a museum and somewhere around the year 0 or thereabouts.
Yeah, it is interesting how historians kind of apply terms. So in my class right now, we're teaching about the Renaissance. I look at the Renaissance as its own little period of time, and at the same time, it kind of falls at the tail end of what we call the medieval or Middle Ages and the modern age. So some of my friends who are medievalists, they'll just argue that the Renaissance is just a part of the Middle Ages, and I always push back and no, it's not. No, it's its own separate thing.
You can't take the Renaissance.
But they're made up. They're applied terms that we think of. Yeah. So in general, antiquity is kind of just pushing us back, certainly before the printing press. And in general terms, for me, it's like pre-fall of Roman Empire. So that's 400s. 700, 800, it's really, we just go ahead and say, well, that's the Middle Ages or the medieval period. So middle between Rome and modern is kind of the general process. But the point is, if you picked anything, particularly from antiquity, so say 400 and back into the BC era, you're going to find more support for Jesus as a historical figure, including all the aspects about Jesus, and support for the Bible as these documents are historically secure, than you will find for any other thing of antiquity. In fact, if you look at things from the Middle Ages, I think you're going to find the same thing. It's amazing sometimes when you really start digging into it. Like I just did a real quick glance, and we don't have time to get into it, about like the writings of Thomas Aquinas or the action of Charlemagne, things he did. And you start looking for the actual single pieces of evidence that supports, like, was there a dude named Charlemagne? Did a guy write the Summa Theologica? Did that guy write it? You start realizing we don't have tons and tons of evidence as you would for something like, did John F. Kennedy get assassinated? You have tons of individual pieces. You have individual eyewitnesses, individual films and photos and different aspects that you could say, here's all the evidence that there was a man named John F. Kennedy, and then he was killed at this time in this place and in this manner. But when you go back even to, so Aquinas is like the 1200s, it's like the evidence is sort of not thin, but it's just not as deep as we'd wish.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, it's interesting. And just to circle back to a point you made earlier, it's so interesting that there's plenty of room for somebody to go, I do believe that the Bible is historically, has an integrity to it. It's real. It's not something just put together in recent years, but I don't believe its message or whatever. There's plenty of intellectual honesty room there to go, to hold both in your hands. I think that's just a point worth making there.
Yeah, and perhaps at the end of the series, we're going to kind of dig into that point to sort of say, well, what do I do with that? But we'll leave it alone for now. So that's what we did last time. Any questions or anything else you want to think we need to touch on?
I do have a question, but I have a hunch we're going to get to that question in our conversation today about how we got the New Testament.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, good segue, because what we're going to talk about today is the canon.
All right.
Now,
boom.
If people know me, my daughters will tell you, when we go on vacations, we go to lots of historical places.
Yes.
And if there's a battlefield, if they were here, they would know immediately what I'm about to say. There's a requirement of what has to happen. And that requirement is there has to be a picture of me by a Canon.
Yes.
And you've been to my house. You know I have a large collection.
I'm wondering if that's why you live in Florida, because you're not within 100 or 1,000 miles of some. You're just like, God knew you had to go to Florida. So that was a vacation thing, not an everyday thing.
Yes. But if you've been to the wonderful fort in St. Augustine,
true,
they have lovely cannons.
And I got the pictures. I'd be happy to show you.
I do, exactly. But that's not the Canon we're talking about.
No.
That's got two N's. This is Canon with one N, Canon. All right. So the question is, like I've said before, the Bible's like a library. It's not really a book. It's a library of 66 individual manuscripts, so individual writings. And then I think the honest question is, well, why those 66?
It's a fair question.
And so we're going to dig into that today.
Awesome.
So do you remember the movie The Da Vinci Code?
I barely remember it. I remember the hubbub around it, and I think I remember seeing it, but obviously it was largely forgettable.
Well, Tom Hanks was in it.
Yes,
I like Tom Hanks.
love Tom
So
Hanks.
he's wonderful. The book came out in 2003 by a man named Dan Brown, and then Hanks was in the movie, which came out in 2006. And in the movie, there's a female lead. Her name is Sophie Neveu. I think I'm saying that correct. They're trying to uncover a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you like mystery movies, it's a fun one. Yeah, it's got a lot of stuff. There's a little bit of a scary potential bad guy and stuff. So it's a lot of fun. And along the way, they end up trying to track down some information, and they end up with a historian. I don't know why they didn't call me. The historian in the book, in the movie, is Sir Lee Teabing, and it's played by the wonderful Ian McKellen, who I love.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, that was right after 2006. So it's right after the Lord of the Rings stuff comes out in 1, 2, and 3. So he's in it. I want to see it. And he supposedly helps them find the true history of the church. So there's a ton there. If you ever get a chance to see the movie, it's wonderful. One of the bruhahas you mentioned was that Brown had said and suggested in both interviews and in that kind of introduction that he was a historian. So he was, while it was fictional, he was still kind of leaning in on historical work. he got quickly taken to task by historians, both Christians and non-Christians, because the history was sort of way off. But so here you have this character of a historian who's like, I'm going to tell you this truth. And the idea behind the Da Vinci Code is it's all around a secret in the Bible and the Catholic Church and the Christian faith. So there's just, not to be any spoilers or anything like that. But there's a part in which the historian Teabing, he suggests that the Bible that we have was created in the time of Constantine. Now, if you listen to Unmoored, I think episode 4, we talked a lot about Constantine. I think it was episode 5, actually. But anyway, we talked about Constantine and kind of his role in what I call the warping or the devolving of the Christian faith. And in there, we talked about, and this is historically true, that he chaired and called the Council of Nicaea. All right. So in the book and in the movie, the argument is made that the Bible, the 66 books, was chosen at that moment. So that's 324, I believe it is, or 325. So 300 years after Jesus, that they picked from 80 different Gospels. If you know your New Testament, there are 4 biographies that we call Gospels. So 4 out of 80. And then he even suggested at a point that, we've talked about this before also, the idea of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've talked about that in this series. That there were Gospels then that were found, which of course would be weird because the Dead Sea Scrolls are pre-Jesus. So in any case, the movie was fun. I liked it. I can remember when I went to the theater, because I knew of the bruhaha, the controversy, I took my little notebook, and in the dark, I'm making notes of things that I wanted to pick on or research or comment. That was when I was the pastor of our church.
That's right.
We talked about it at our church. And so the short version of why am I even bringing this up is because that is a snapshot of the question that is said. Why those 66 books? Like, were there 80 gospel accounts? If there were 80, did they tell the same story? It turns out that they don't tell the same story. So then it seems, well, some group 300 years later decided we need to put together this collection, call it the Gospels or call it the Bible, and they picked ones that they thought sounded good to them, that they thought told one story, but then the truth is, the suggestion is, that there's a different story or there's multiple stories. And maybe the whole Jesus thing is made up anyway. Now, again, we've already concluded that the Jesus thing isn't made up because of the historical security of what we've looked at. But still, maybe there were other documents that got, pushed out that shed a different picture of who Jesus is. There's not 80 other Gospels, for instance. There's like 15.
Right.
Most of those are written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which we're going to come back to that next episode. And there's clear historical evidence that says both for the Jewish scriptures and for the writings of these first believers of Jesus, that was all concluded within the 1st century or very close to the 1st century. So we're going to look at that, and I want to kind of defend that position with you. But like you brought it up, kind of a thing, how important it is.
Yeah. You say, council, and I hear committee. Yeah. And I've seen committees. It's a mess. And there's compromises, and I think of our family, and we have the Council of Netflix, and we're like, our goal is to determine what we're going to watch, and half walks away not happy with the results and all this stuff. And if that was the real story of how we got the New Testament, I think there's some real big important questions to ask. But that understanding of the council is kind of flawed from the get-go.
Correct.
As far as what they were about. So
it's not like Congress passing a bill.
Give and take and compromises. And
well, even like today, like we'll argue in our country, as you know, about the original understanding of the Constitution. And a lot of times, now some 250 from the Constitution, but about 230 years from the Constitution, it turns out there's not a lot of clarity on some of the points. The Constitution of the United States is, quite honestly, naturally ambiguous at points. It uses words and phrases, and maybe the dudes in the room in Philadelphia and they wrote it all agreed and knew what they meant, but they didn't give us a dictionary. We mean this today in 1787. It means this for us now. And so then now we look back, we're like, well, I'm not sure what all that means, and trying to figure out kind of what to decide about those kinds of things. it's not like we're 200 something years away from Jesus, and then we should probably clarify, and then we say, oh, look, there's all these writings, some 15 to 20 different writings about Jesus. There's a whole bunch of other writings from a ton of other people, and now we need to pick what's good.
Right.
So that is not the story.
That's not the situation.
I mean, I could maybe wish it was, particularly if I don't want to believe in Christianity. But as a historian, as I've said before, I don't have a dog in the fight. I mean, as we've said openly before, you and I both are Christians.
Right.
So I do want the Bible to be true, but approaching this as a historian, I'm open to whatever happens. So like I've already told you, we're going to look at this next time. There are other quote unquote gospels. We need to examine them and say, hey, maybe they should have been included. And they were written before Nicaea. So it is fair that somebody at Nicaea could have said, hey, what about that one?
Right.
And so as a historian, I'm with, what about that one? Well, why wasn't it included? So we're going to do that.
Yeah.
Next episode is going to be a continuation of the canon for the New Testament. But if you know a Christian, you know they have 66 books, not just 27 books. So they've incorporated the writings from the Old Testament. So we want to get to those.
Yeah.
Now, this word canon, not the thing that shoots projectiles that I like to get pictures in front of. What it means is a rule. It comes from the Greek, and they kind of took it from Hebrew. And in Hebrew, what the word stood for was like a stalk or a reed. And the point of it was that was used as a measuring stick. And so when you hear rule from Greek, they don't mean don't do this. They mean what we would call a ruler. And a ruler being, most of us, of course, I don't know if you have these. Do they have these you get kids in grammar school. Do they have rulers anymore?
You know, I haven't seen any. They got to be around somewhere.
You know, when I was a kid, when school starting up, when we're recording this, it's starting up, in a few weeks or so, you had things you had to have, and a ruler was one of them.
And paste. You got to have paste. Yep. Who's going to eat the paste?
Did you ever have people hit you with their ruler?
I'm sure I did at some point.
That was painful.
Probably teachers.
Yeah. So the idea then of a ruler, or the idea of it saying rule, coming from the Hebrew, then connection back to a measuring stick of sorts, is the concept that then you could always get a clear measure of the thing with the canon, right? Nice. So the Greeks then extended that concept to mean standard or guide. So like you and I, if we were trying to measure something that was 6 inches or 12 inches, it's not flexible, it's not arbitrary. The standard of 6 inches is this length, and if I can't just guess, a ruler shows me precisely what it is. So that's kind of the idea. And then that idea got extended into saying, what is the sanctioned or accepted work or body of works of like X, Y, or Z? All right. So another pop culture reference. Do you remember when Disney bought Star Wars?
I do. Yeah. And it was long ago than I realized.
Yeah, 2012. Yeah.
Yeah, 2012. I feel like it's in the last 5 years. You're like,
nope.
No.
Okay. How deep is your Star Wars pop knowledge, sir?
I don't know. I'm going to give myself, I'm still probably a Padawan on this. I don't think I'm a Jedi.
Well, the first lesson for all the listeners is never call the first Star Wars A New Hope. Never, ever do that. This is Carl's rule.
Yeah.
I know Lucas disagrees. So you're going me versus Lucas.
Yes.
You pick who you're going to be with. First one is Star Wars.
Yes, that's a revisionist kind of.
Exactly.
It's A New Hope.
Right.
It's A New Hope for you.
So the first one, number one, is Star
Wars.
Then The Empire Strikes Back.
Yep.
Then The Jedi. Right?
Yep.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by the way they've counted it. Okay, but here's the point. By the time, so Disney does this in 2012. Star Wars comes out in 1977. So you're 40-ish years, right? In those 40 years, you've heard of fan fiction, I know.
Yes.
People think fan fiction is a new concept. It is not. It's a very old concept. And there was all kinds of writings and things relative to what was about Star Wars. People took the ideas. Some of these were done by people who were sanctioned by Lucas. Some were just on the fly. When Disney took over, they declared that all of those were not part of the canon. And they called them legends.
Interesting.
And the doo-doo hit the fan.
Yes.
The longtime fans, old people like me who had seen Star Wars and they were a teenager in the theater for the very first time, lost their minds.
Yes.
because if you're really in, and I'm not that deep in, like I don't have those stories in on my personal library, but if you were really in, you knew of stories, of characters, of planets, of battles that had all taken place, and had previously been sanctioned by Lucas as like, yep, that's all cool stuff. There were video games, all these things. And in 2012, Disney said, yeah, none of that stuff counts.
Wow.
And so, just arbitrarily, you have character X who is doing blankety blank on certain place.
Yes.
If you'd asked Lucas pre-2012, he'd be like, yeah, that's probably what's happening for that guy. He's not going to be any movie that I'm going to worry about.
Yeah.
And then Disney, who obviously had this big plan of like expanding and doing all the shows they've done on Disney Plus and other places and movies 7, 8, and 9 of the original trilogy, and then all the other stuff that's been on, all the different shows. I like almost all of them, and I watch almost all of them because I like the Star Wars world. They're like, yep, none of those people are legit. And so if you really dig into it, you'll find some people who've showed up in some of these Disney Plus episodes in different moments and planets. And old timers will just get so frustrated because like that person's not supposed to be there. They're at this other place at this moment. And they know the chronology and they know all the dates and stuff like that.
Yeah. Interesting.
But that's that idea of what is the canon? So what is in the accepted group or body of works? Disney came along in 2012 and said, yep, we're changing it. And now everything after 2012 is considered canonical. That's how you say the word. But everything before that doesn't count. You can't count any of that stuff. So for the Bible then, there is this determination of what was considered authoritative as coming from God, inspired by God. And this is an important thing for us to dig into before we spend a little more time on the Old Testament. In other words, if I'm not a Christian, I might think, why does it matter? I mean, I might have a real loose understanding of like, I guess these books are like holy, or maybe God dictated it to a secretary somewhere or something. And then when you read the Bible, you're shocked because it's not like that at all. Or if that's really dictated by God, God's got a weird sense of humor.
Yeah.
Because he's got a bunch of weird stories in there. And that's an inaccurate historical view, both about God, but about what the Bible is. It's not 66 books of here's how to live your life. It's 66 books, 39 of which, from a Christian point of view, or in the Jewish scriptures, we'll see it's 22, but of like God's messaging to his people and their own grappling with what it means to be part of God's people. And then in the 27 books, the New Testament, then their understanding and grappling with this person of Jesus, who we've talked about as a historical person, and then what does it mean for him to make these claims that he makes? What does it mean for extending this offer of grace and quote-unquote salvation to everybody beyond the Jewish people? And so there's lots of words you may have heard about connected to the Bible. We're not going to touch any of those words today. The main thing for me is this word authoritative. And so what I mean by that is, as I sit in the 21st century and I think I want to be a follower of Jesus, and I want to understand this book, and I want to understand this book for its relationship to the U.S. founders and how much they valued it and thought it was important about setting up our laws and all that stuff we've talked about, then why these 66? There's a part of my brain that goes, I don't get to pick and choose which of these books I'm going to like or not like. I'm under the authority, or I've submitted myself to the people who are closest to the work at the moment. So in the New Testament case, the cats who walked with Jesus, and in the Jewish case, as we'll see, those who were wrestling with this idea of like God's movement with these people and his sometimes direct word to them, and then at other times their reflection like of that that idea of being God's chosen people. And then they're writing about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's not an academic thing for people who believe what can be trusted and what is, if I find a piece of a Post-it note scribbled a prescription, I'm like, am I gonna risk my life on?
Yeah.
I need to check this out.
Yeah.
I think something legitimate would look different. It matters.
Right. There's a guy I listen to a lot. He's out in Portland. His name is Tim Mackey, and he's a Bible scholar broadly, a Hebrew and Old Testament scholar more specifically. And in specifically talking about the Hebrew writings, which we're about to segue to, he said this is my notes of him saying this, but that the Hebrew Bible is a series of documents that tell the story of quote unquote our family, meaning Jewish people writing about themselves, and the quote unquote why we as Jewish people exist in the world and what our God is doing through our family. And then further, there's other written documents that clarify and explain this idea of a partnership between, God and his people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If you go back to episode 1, one of the things that I talked about was I kind of described the Bible as the story of the maker, and as a way for me to kind of grapple with understanding, not just for this podcast, but for my whole life. Like, I want to understand the story of the world. And I believe there is a story of the world. And I believe it involves the idea that there's this being who I've given it this title of the maker. G.K. Chesterton uses similar type terms, and other people have used these terms, so it's not unique to me. And then in episode 1, so what I described the kind of the history of the humans as something that the maker made. There was a garden, there were humans, and then it got all corrupted. And then out of that moment, this all connects to this concept of who Jesus is and why it mattered for the New Testament thinkers to want to reflect back upon the Jewish writings. Remember, all those people originally who were with Jesus were Jewish at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So they're part of this family that I just mentioned. And yet they believe something about Jesus. We've talked about this word Messiah a couple of times, but we've not really expanded on it. But it kind of connects to, like, I get kind of all over the place, I suppose. Somebody could look at the Bible and say, well, hang on a second. Isn't it about the Christians? Isn't this a Christian thing, like a Jewish? And it's like, well, there's more to it. But if they thought it's a Christian thing, then why do I need these first 39 books?
Right.
I got nothing to do with, that's like 300 years, 400 years before Jesus. So who cares, right? And I know there are people who claim to be Christians, and that is kind of their position. They don't even really look at the Old Testament books, or they kind of see them as some flawed reflection. That's a different conversation. But just somebody could say that, like, I want to know, or I want to know God. I guess I just need to read these 27, right? That's all I need to look at. And that's not the position Jesus took. It's not the position of the first people. And so when I'm saying Messiah, think back to what I said in episode 1 then. This idea of the maker, after the corruption happens, I told you that he makes this promise to the, metaphorical Adam and Eve, right? These first humans, that even though there's this loss, he's going to provide a descendant of the woman who will fix things, short version, right? And then you may remember I told you about then the maker later connects with like a second couple, Abram and Sarai. And he says to them that this savior person being is going to come through them, right? So in other words, they become the Jewish nation. And so the picture we have is this expectation of this being who is coming to put things right, coming from the maker through this Jewish people. And over the years, that's the term that gets used called Messiah in the Jewish, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, it's all familiar ground for you. Yeah. Where we get the word Christ is the Greek translation of Messiah. And it gets back to this, well, what does Messiah mean? Anointed one, and we're not going to go down that road. Just understand that for somebody with Jesus at the beginning who's thinking, oh, this is the Messiah, they're expecting this promised hero to show up, and the title that they gave was this thing, Messiah. That's why I've always said, Jesus is his name, Christ is his title. It'd be like saying Donald the president or Joe Biden the president. And we would know that last part is just the title. So Christ is not a name, Christ is just the title. Yeah. And it's the Greek version of Messiah that would be, in the Hebrew. And so the Christians then were thinking, we need to then understand the writings of our own people, because they're all Jews, the first ones, first believers. And they saw in those writings proof of who the Messiah would be, and then aspects about that Messiah, that Savior. And then they believed Jesus, this historical figure we've talked about, fulfilled or matched all those. Now, that's a whole different conversation whether he did or didn't. We're not touching that part yet. But again, I'm just trying to help set up, well, why do we even care about the Old Testament?
Yeah.
So, all right, I'll make sure I'm where I need to be. Are you good?
I'm good. I'm in.
Okay. What's the Old Testament? Then what's the Jewish scripture? Let's try to use that phrase from here on out. The Jewish scripture. There's three main sections. The three main sections, there's either 24 or 22 books, depending on how you count it. They had different collections of how they put some things together. So like a Christian Bible will have 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They did not have that. They just had it all kind of put together. So you can count the books the same.
Okay.
But the books are the same 39. They're just counted differently.
Okay.
Three main sections. The first section is called the Torah. That's the 5 books of the law. Sometimes you'll hear them the books of Moses. The second section is the Nevi'im. There's 8 in that section, and that's the writings of the prophets. And if you know, again, the Old Testament, there's some small ones at the back like Haggai and Nahum. They're all lumped together in one book called the 12. And then there's the Ketuvim, which is sort of like the everything else. It's the catch-all group. Ketuvim stands for writings.
Okay.
But you have one of the history books in there. You have Daniel, who in a Christian point of view is considered one of the prophets. So you have some history books, you have some poetry, Psalms is there, Proverbs, basically everything else. So there's the 5 law, Torah, the 8 major prophets, which one of those books is 12 prophets, and then there's everybody else. And so together, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim ends up being used as an acronym of Tanakh. So the Jewish think, when you say, they wouldn't say like their Bible. They'd understand if you were saying you're probably a Christian. They would say the Tanakh. So in the Tanakh, all right? So Jewish thinkers and Jewish scholars believed that God last spoke to his people through the prophet Malachi. In an Old Testament Bible, you would see it as the last of those 39. And this is somewhere 450 to 430 BC. And so, for instance, there's a very important historical figure after that named Simon Maccabees. And in the historical record about that, he says, he's quoted as saying, "So there was great distress in Israel, such as had not been seen since the time a prophet had last appeared among them." And we've not had a prophet, and they don't claim to be one, and they don't claim one shows up. So in other words, God quit speaking to his people at that moment, so that 450. And just as a reminder of the timeline, we've done this in other places, but you have the nation gets in trouble. They get taken into captivity by the nation of Assyria and then the nation of Babylon. And then the Persians come along and allow them to go back and rebuild the temple. So they rebuild the temple. That's completed in 515 BC. Then there's another very famous guy. His name is Nehemiah. He was actually worked in the administration of the Persian government, but he was Jewish. And then he basically had this idea of I want to go back and try to build the protective wall around Jerusalem, got to have permission. And the then leader Xerxes is like, yep, go for it. Here's some money. I'll hook you up. So that wall is finished in 445 BC. So that's at the same time as Malachi. So Malachi is considered one of the post-exile prophets. So it's after the exile. There's still some God speaking, saying some different things. There's another guy who's really important with Nehemiah called Ezra. And then the last kind of compilation that's put together is the history book of Chronicles, which again in a Christian Bible is 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but just think of it as writing. If you've ever read the Bible, you know the history books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and Kings, and then you get to 1st and Chronicles and it repeats itself. In fact, recently I read through the Bible and I read it more chronologically. So the last book that I read in the Old Testament were the Chronicles. So out of order, if you just flipping through a table of contents, it's out of order what you would see in a Christian Bible. But it's chronologically correct to read it after you read Malachi because it's kind of the last compilation. All right, have I lost you so far? Are you good?
I think as long as there's not a quiz, I am up to.
Okay.
I think I'm following along.
So it's at this moment in this, say, 400-year window post-exile that you start having this real concern with we need to collect all this stuff that we think God has spoken to us about, right? So that makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So then we need to back up a little bit before that to get a running start to that moment to say, what was there ever a moment when they're saying this is like the Tanakh, right? And you have to realize as you're moving through historical time, all of it doesn't exist at that time. So, like, for instance, the first things we have are the early stories that are attributed to Moses, though at points it's very clear somebody's editing it and putting stuff in there. That's 1200, 1100 BC. And I just told you Chronicles was put together in 400. So in 1100 BC, there's no book of Chronicles. So kind of working through time.
Right.
And it starts with an oral tradition, like most ancient peoples have an oral tradition. So for instance, in the Exodus story, we're told more than once about Moses saying to the people, God said blah, blah, blah. So there's this oral tradition. We need to learn these things. We need to memorize these things. And then as you go through the Old Testament writings, the historical record, you can see a few times, there's at least 3 really specific times we're told where there's a thing that's written and the quote unquote nation or people of Israel go, we believe that and we accept that as authoritative. There's an early moment with Moses. There's a middle moment based at the time of King Josiah. So that's around 620, 621 BC. And then there's another moment with Nehemiah and Ezra, who I mentioned, so roughly 445 BC. So you got these moments where they're reading something specific and saying, this is thus the word of the Lord, kind of a thing. And the people going, we got it. That's the books. That's our thing.
So, I mean, so you just said this, but just kind of reteeing it up, that it's not that all of these things transpired and then many, many, many years hence, we say these are the things. There's these periodic moments. It's kind of being verified and codified and go, yes, this is the thing, as they're going along.
Correct.
Which is important, very pertinent.
And as they're going, you get the idea that they're recognizing what they have as like authoritative from God.
Mm-hmm.
So like the first 5 books of the Torah, right? The first part of the Tanakh. They're going, this is the word of the Lord. This is the law. Sometimes you use a code, they'll say the law. Although if you read the first 5 books, it's not all a bunch of laws. And so, like, for instance, in the time of Josiah, and we talked about this previously, that we're told that they found the law, meaning they had lost it and they didn't have it. And if you read in the histories, you're like, yep, clearly you lost it because you certainly were living like not people trying to be God's people. And so, but meaning they found something that was written. They didn't find a memory of it. They found the actual papers of it. And then they're reading it, and there's a moment where the king's like shocked. He's like, oh my gosh. It'd be like, well, that's not a good example, I suppose, but if you think we have forgotten things about the Constitution and then you find it, if it hadn't been found and we didn't have a copy for 100 years and then you found it, you're like, oh, wait, there's supposed to be 2 houses of Congress? Well, I didn't know that, right? You'd be legit for saying you didn't know, and then you're like, well, no wonder we're having problems. We don't have 2 houses of Congress, because it's in the document. So they'd kind of lost it and forgotten it, kind of a thing. All right, so then they have all these latter things that happen. So when you read the latter parts of it, including the Chronicles, you remember the story of Esther, which is a wonderful story, which goes along time-wise with where Nehemiah and Ezra are. And so those things are obviously happening in the 400s and late 500s, so they couldn't have been written about at the time of Josiah, but they're then collecting and writing those in. Okay, so you get to this place around 400, and we feel confident that what we call the Old Testament is settled. Right? Okay. We good so far?
Yeah.
All right. How can we know that it's settled then? That's the part I want us to finish up with.
Yeah.
And there's some moments from around again. So we can say we're at 400, or Malachi quits talking, Chronicles is put together, Ezra's had her moment. The end. Put a bow on it. But then how do we know a bow was on it? How do we know there wasn't something else? Or like, how do we know there's not 80 Gospels? Or maybe there's something else that should have been included. And to be fair, just so everybody realizes, when they come back to Jerusalem, a lot of Jews stayed in Babylon. So they're not talking to each other on the phone. They don't have conversations. So there's a sense in which what's in Babylon kind of exists on its own. And then to deepen the story a little bit, when they get back to the quote-unquote promised land, you may have heard of a term, Samaritans. So there's another group of Jewish people who actually didn't go into exile. It's a longer story, but they're kind of doing their own thing. So now you could arguably say, well, there's a group in Babylon, there's a group in Jerusalem, there's a group in Samaria. And then with the people being spread out all over, turns out that there's a bunch of Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt. There's some that have moved over to Greece. There's already these spread out moments. So you have all these different peoples who are there, right? So again, you and I could say, I bet they had like 4 different Bibles, right? 4 different collections. And then today you and I could look back and say, oh, well, in Babylon, they had 19 books and 11 of those were in nobody else's Bible.
Right.
And you and I would have questions about why these 39 then must have been picked by the Christians later.
Right.
And then we can argue that the Christians were picking and choosing what they wanted. All right, so here we go. We're going to dig into it. The first big moment occurs around 250. So only about 150 years after we'd finished what we just said, and it happens in Alexandria. So in Alexandria, there was a large collection of Jewish people, maybe as many as 1 million or so living in that place. And we know that at a point, somewhere in that process around 250, the then king over that area, this is pre-Roman Empire, Ptolemy II, he requests the Jewish high priest of the area, a man named Eleazar, to translate the Jewish writings into Greek. So the story is that there's 72 scholars, 6 from each tribe. For some reason, they use the name in Latin that means 70 instead of 72. I don't know. I've never understood that.
All right.
And the word is Septuagint.
Okay.
So the Septuagint then is a translation of the Hebrew writings into Greek. The story is they did it in 72 days. That's probably inaccurate. There's some writings that support this that really are probably or either forgeries or they were written later than they said they were written. But the long story short is somewhere between 250 and say 100 BC, they finished putting the Bible together into Greek. This actually would be the version of Greek that many of the Bible that many in Jerusalem would have known of. And often, if you look in the New Testament, some of the quotes by the disciples, or at least that are put together by the writers of the Gospels, they use the Septuagint version versus then the Hebrew directly. They don't go back to the Hebrew when they're doing that. That's a side point, but nonetheless. When we're done, the point of me pointing out the Septuagint to you is that those same 22, 24 books are what they translate.
Okay.
Now, they do translate some other writings that occurred after Malachi and Chronicles, which gets to a whole secondary topic, which maybe needs to be a bonus episode later, called the Deuterocanonical books.
There's your big word for the day.
Deuterocanonical. Now, Deuterocanonical means second canon. And there's a whole bunch more to get into that. I'm even in my head now. I'm like, how much can we say? Let's just say that these are useful historical books, some great poetry, and some great exposition of what was life like for the Jewish people, what was going on in Jewish thought, wisdom literature, writings at that time after Malachi and Chronicles, before you get to the time of Jesus. And so we'll just leave it alone for now as to what happened with those books. They did translate those. Some of them didn't have to translate. They were in Greek already. Okay. So that's the point, is that they didn't translate many of them because they were not written in Hebrew. They were written in Greek. You got to remember that the time of the Septuagint, even in Jerusalem, is the time after Alexander the Great. So Greek is the lingua franca. It's the language of the time. Now, one of those books, for instance, though, is helpful for us. It's called the Book of Ecclesiasticus. It's sometimes called the Wisdom or the Wisdom of Syriac. It's written, again, as I said, somewhere early 2nd century, like 180, 175 BC. In it, the writer talks about the Hebrew collection of the Tanakh, and he talks about the law, the prophets, and others that followed them, the thing that's later called the writings. So in other words, here's a writing in 180, 175, and it's narrowing down to the same collection that we're saying is the Jewish scripture. Later, at roughly the same time Jesus is alive, there's a man in Alexandria named Philo. And Philo was, according to the Britannica, this quote here for a second, was a Greek-speaking Jewish philosopher, the most important representative of Hellenistic Judaism. Hellenistic meaning Greek-based Judaism, right? So Philo writes, and when he writes, he does a whole bunch of philosophical stuff. He quotes his own Jewish Tanakh, the same 24 writings. He never quotes anything but those writings, right? Get to Jesus. He's obviously an important Jewish figure historically for us and for our purposes. We don't have to worry here if he's the Messiah. We have a record of stuff he said and did, and some of his people with him and his supporters. They also quote only from those 24. And there's a couple of places where Jesus talks about the law and the prophets. And when he says that, he's not just trying to be random. He's saying, you know what's in our holy writings. He's using the code word for it. And there's other places where he mentions the law and the prophets and the writings. He says the Psalms, but the Psalms is like the leading book in that collection. So here you have this idea then of Jesus referencing everything. There's another place where he talks about he's kind of fussing at the Jewish leaders of the time, and he says to them that they've killed all the prophets, and he says the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah will cry out of the ground and accuse you. Well, the blood of Abel's a Genesis story. Zechariah is one of the last stories in Chronicles. So it'd be like if you or I said, it's in the Bible from Genesis to Malachi.
It's A to Z, too.
A to Z, exactly.
That's crazy.
And so, yeah, exactly. It is A to Z, but it's that, again, beginning to end. And he's trying to reference in code that his Jewish audience would know these 24.
So even contemporaneously, it's establishing that these are the ones, and these are significant, but they stand over here apart from these.
Yeah, it's not even, and there's no concern or thought about the deuterocanonical writings. It's not good or bad.
Right.
It's just saying, if you're asking me whether it's Philo or whether it's the writer of Ecclesiasticus or Jesus or Peter or Matthew, what's the Jewish reflection, to go back to Mackie, of the story of God with these people and his rescue mission and the covenantal engagement? It's these 24 that tell us that story.
Yeah.
And that's all we need to say now. Yeah. One more piece. Remember Josephus? We talked about him back in the other podcast. He's one of these key, very important Jewish writers. We talked about him as far as non-Christian evidence about the life of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So when he writes, he says the same sort of thing, that there's the 22 books. And you know, if this, again, here's an example. Why 22 instead of 24? He's combining Ruth and Judges. It's you get into it and you're just like, oh, okay, but we're still talking about the same, from a Christian layout of the Old Testament, the same 39 books, the same books. We're not adding any, we're not subtracting any. So clearly by the time you get into the life of Jesus and in the first century AD, it's very clear. Josephus is obviously writing at the end of the first century AD. So his writings. And that leads us to one last piece of evidence to lay out there. There's a city in the Palestine area called Jamnia. All right. Now there's a thing that's often called the Council of Jamnia. That's an unfortunate designation because, as you said earlier, when we were talking about the Council of Nicaea, it sounds like a meeting, sounds like a committee, some group of dudes getting together. That's not what happened here. So at this time, there's a leading rabbi named Johanan ben Zazaki. I think I'm saying that correct, but if not. And he got permission from the then Roman emperor. I'm pretty sure it's Titus, but it's about 90 AD, so it's not. No, it's not Titus. I don't think. I should have had that written down. He gets permission from the Roman emperor to gather other Jewish scholars. So in 70 AD, Titus, that's for real, not the guy in the Bible, in case you're thinking about it, but a Roman general. He comes to kind of deal with the Jewish problem that, remember, the whole thing with Jesus and Pontius Pilate was like, oh, there's going to be a rebellion, and the Romans don't want another rebellion. Mm-hmm. So 40 years later, they're like, you know what, enough of you people. We're tired of all this. And they come and they destroyed the temple and destroyed some of the city, but really just wanted to get rid of the center of issue. And so they destroyed the temple. So 20 years-ish later, Jewish thinkers are thinking, well, now what do? We don't have our temple anymore. And it basically occurs to them, we still have our holy writings. We still believe we're God's chosen people. We don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. We don't believe any of that stuff. But we have this story of God's relationship with us. Let's make sure we're secure on this and other aspects. If there's no temple, how do we approach God anymore? How do we deal? There's no way to have sacrifices. So really you can think of an ongoing, like, scholastic community, gathering, talking, pondering, referencing. And in that moment, they conclude, or they reaffirm, this is God's word to us, these 24 books. They examined them all. There's a couple that they wondered about. Esther was one of the ones who are like, because God's not even mentioned in Esther.
Not even mentioned.
So maybe that's not supposed to be there. But there's a great example of the authoritative. Here in 90 AD, they're looking back to 400 BC and certainly to the 250 mark, and they're going, yeah, no, I think it needs to be included. I think it's supposed to be there. And they had some debates and all this kind of stuff. So, but for our purposes, we can just say that the leading Jewish thinkers and religious people of the day, at the same time Josephus is making his comment, are saying it's these 24. And so when the Christians come along and kind of tie it together, and we get to the idea of a Christian Bible. And as I said, they're thinking as mostly Jewish people, and they're thinking, we think Jesus is this Savior promised, and they want to then find the evidence for that in the old writings, the Jewish writings. They're not picking and choosing which Jewish writings. They're merely looking, again, these mostly Jews, they're looking at their own people's history and their own religious leaders to say, these are the writings. And so we're going to pick it up from there next time. Do you have any like things that I've said that you're like, wait, I'm not sure about?
No, but I like the last thing that you said there, that what we understand is the Old Testament was not pieced together with a particular narrative in mind. It was established. They're simply going back to this established body of work to look for hints that the Savior was going. It was not assembled with an agenda in mind of proving a point.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we'll pick it up there next time. All right, see you, man.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.